Welcome to The Writing Life, the podcast for everyone who writes. I'm Steph, your host, greeting you from a frosty National Centre for Writing in Norwich, UNESCO City of Literature. Before we dive into today's episode, let me take a moment to wish you a joyful and inspiring start to 2025. Have you set any writing goals for the year? Maybe you're considering venturing into something new. If so, let me introduce you to an exciting opportunity to kickstart your creativity. It's called The Write Habit. Launching on the 1st of March for just £30, The Write Habit is a 30-day online writing challenge designed to ignite your creativity and help you to establish a consistent writing routine. Designed by National Centre for Writing, each day you'll receive a fresh, original prompt or exercise straight to your inbox. All it takes is 15 minutes a day to develop new skills, find your creative flow, and build a sustainable and inspiring writing habit. If you want to learn more or sign up, visit nationalcentreforwriting.org.uk/write habit. Now, let's move on to today's episode, where we're thrilled to feature Chloe Dalton. Chloe is a foreign policy specialist turned writer who brings a wealth of experience to her craft. She spent over a decade as a special advisor and speechwriter in the UK Parliament and Foreign and Commonwealth Office. These days, she works as a consultant on international political and humanitarian issues. Her debut book, Raising Hare, chronicles the extraordinary journey of raising a leveret to adulthood and beyond. Chloe recently sat down with Holly Ainley, Head of Programme and Creative Engagement at NCW, for an insightful conversation about the art and impact of nature writing. Together, they explore how writing about the natural world can educate and entertain, the practice of keen observation, and the vital role of research when capturing the nuances of wildlife and the environment. So without further ado, here's Holly in conversation with Chloe Dalton.
Welcome, Chloe Dalton, to the Writing Life podcast. Thank you so much for being with us here today.
Thank you, Holly. I'm thrilled.
And congratulations on the huge success of Raising Hare, which seems to have been garnering amazing reviews and accolades and just really connecting with readers.
Oh, it's so lovely to hear that. It's still very new for me as a first-time author, but the thought that it has resonated with people or is resonating with people means a lot to me.
Well, let's start with the hare, the star of the show. So tell us about how the hare came into your life and then how the book grew out of that experience.
Well, when the pandemic sort of hit and it became apparent that lockdowns were on the way, I was in a lucky position that I had somewhere to go to leave London, which is where I was working. And my life was entirely based in London. I travelled overseas. I worked as a foreign policy advisor, so I was always abroad. But anyway, I like lots of people, I had concerns about my family, so I went to the north of England and found myself living in a little converted barn in the middle of nowhere so I could be near my parents. And I was entirely focused on the day that I would go back to the city when life would, return to normal as I thought of it. And I knew that I was incredibly lucky to be in a wonderful place and to have access to the countryside, but I didn't really notice it as much as others might have done because I was so focused on my work, which carried on, and on this idea of a return. So I was stomping down the track or stomping around the fields around my house when it was possible to do so during the different restrictions and barely noticing the landscape at all. That sounds strange. I'm just freely offering it was really the case. And one of those cold February mornings in 2021, I was preparing to go out for a little walk and I heard a disturbance in the fields near my house, which was quite unusual because, as I say, it's quite isolated. And I heard the noise of a man shouting and a dog barking in a sort of frenzied way. And I went out to see what was going on and I couldn't see any sign of a man or the dog, but I came across this tiny little leveret, perhaps 1 or 2 days old at most, that was lying on the track quite near my house in a very, very exposed position.
And a leveret, for anyone who doesn't know, is a baby hare.
Yes, absolutely. Well, the astonishing thing for me was that I had never seen a hare, living or dead. Obviously, I'd seen depictions of them, how they're on tea towels and notebooks and things, but I'd never knowingly seen a hare before. And yet somehow in that second that my eyes fell upon this creature, I knew that it was a hare. And I also found I had the word leveret somewhere in the back of my mind to describe it. And there's something rather extraordinary about them because they're born above ground. Unlike rabbits, there are different species to rabbits. Hares live all their lives exposed to the elements. So a baby hare, a leveret, is born with its eyes open and a full coat of fur. And so obviously, they're beautiful, adorable looking like all young things, but they have a kind of wildness to them and a mystery to them because it's a perfect miniature of an adult hare rather than a little sort of like a puppy's born, not really looking much like the adult dog going to him with his eyes shut, So, but anyway, the experience began with this encounter. I knew enough about countryside or wild animals, even as the sort of city dweller. I knew that I shouldn't touch it and leave it undisturbed, and I crept away from it, hoping perhaps or imagining that its mother would come back for it. But when I returned 4 or 5 hours later, it was still in the same exposed position in the middle of this track that's used by vehicles with lots of buzzards and birds of prey in the air. And I looked at it and I was worried about it. I thought perhaps it was injured, and I made this snap decision that I was going to bring it into my house for what I imagined to be a couple of hours, and that I would return it to the field under the cover of nightfall when it might have more of a chance of being united with its mother if its mother was still alive. And when the leveret came into my life, I thought that it would be initially for a very, very short period of time. And I made a point of not touching its fur so I wouldn't transfer my scent to it. I wrapped it in grass and carried it into the house. But I was informed very quickly by a conservationist who I rang, who said to me, I'm sorry to tell you, you won't be able to return it to the wild. It will smell of a human home. And moreover, so if its mother's alive, she might well reject it. And actually also, I'm sorry to tell you that I've heard of people raising all manner of creatures, but hares have never been domesticated. They don't do well in human hands, and you're probably going to have to accept that it's going to die. So for me, I felt in that moment extremely ashamed. Perhaps I'd intervened unnecessarily. Perhaps this animal was going to die as a result of my intervention. So the experience began with a determination on my side that somehow, even though I was the least likely person to have this experience, that I would do my best to keep the creature alive. And for the first first 5 months, I suppose, of the experience, there was absolutely no thought in my mind of documenting the experience of the story. I was just focused on my work and then living alongside this little creature, which I never caged and I didn't give a name. I considered it to be a wild animal that didn't belong to me. It belonged to the wild, and my job was just to keep it alive so it could return to the wild.
Yeah. So how did the idea for the book grow? Did it begin with note taking, or did you keep a diary? Decide to start keeping a diary?
Well, there was a particular moment when the leveret was 4 months old, and I'd been looking at it every day, thinking, sooner or later you've got to leave. How do I make this decision? I'm quite attached to you, but are you going to survive in the wild? And it took the decision out of my hands by leaping over the garden wall. I have quite a high dry stone wall around part of the garden, and to my astonishment, I saw the leveret, and I described this in the book, on the crest of the wall, and it jumped out into the wild, and I thought that was it. I thought this beautiful experience had come to an end, and that I would never see the hare again. But to my astonishment, it leapt back over the wall a few hours later, and at that point, and lay down in the house and rested and went to sleep. And at that point, I thought to myself that I was witnessing something quite unusual, that this was a creature that had the wild at its disposal, but yet was choosing to return to a human home, which it did. So the pattern of the days is that the hare goes out at night and returns in the morning and sleeps in the house or sleeps in the garden nearby. And at that point, I started to take some notes just for myself. And that kind of person, I live with a notebook in my hand.
Yeah.
Like lots of the people who listen to this podcast. So it felt very natural to sort of take this sort of bare skeleton. It wasn't a diary at all, but I would write a date and something that I'd noticed about this animal, because I became increasingly fascinated by the difference between the way hares are portrayed in culture, in literature, in books about animals, and what I was observing in practice. Because in order to understand how to keep this animal alive, I'd ordered up all the books I could find from the London Library, and I treated it like a research project. And so I had these stacks of books, and I would be reading them in the evening after my day of work and observing the leveret behaving in a certain way, and then reading about hares doing something completely different, supposedly in myth or culture and legend. So I was observing, and I suppose in a way preparing for a book without realizing that that's what I was doing.
Which is astonishing, really, that this is then where you ended up. And there's lots of things I want to unpack there. You mentioned about your research, also that sort of very beautiful art of observation and noticing. I want to come back to both of those things. But I think before we go any further, I just want to get right stuck into the subject of today's podcast, which is nature writing, and ask what that means to you, because I suspect that whilst you were writing, you perhaps weren't thinking, oh, I'm doing a piece of nature writing. It was just very intuitive to you. So perhaps, did you even care about that label? And I guess secondary to that does it now feel like a comfortable description or sort of one of the categories that the book has been placed under?
Well, I'm happy to freely admit that I didn't know an enormous amount about nature writing at all. It wasn't a genre that I read personally, in a kind of conscious way. I hadn't been conscious. I was taking books and going, this is nature writing. For me, I thought of it as a story. And when I began to discuss the book with a literary agent and ultimately with the publisher, I would say this extraordinary experience. I've had this extraordinary experience. So I'm living through this extraordinary experience because it was still obviously continuing. And the labeling of the kind of book that it would be came out of those conversations. And I remember, and I'm really happy to admit it, because I wrote for a living, but I wrote for other people. I wrote as I was a special advisor and speechwriter, and that's what I did for my trade. And we might even come back to that, I imagine, because it's quite a different thing to do, to write for somebody else and write for yourself. But it was, after some of those meetings, I found myself sort of Googling some of the terms that people were using about narrative nonfiction and nature writing, to sort of understand that was, I suppose, the category that I had been put into in order for it to be understood what it was, what the book would be. And so I've grown more comfortable with the terms over time. They are very, very slippery. What is nature? There's a lot of time talking about that. I in my work, I spend a lot of time thinking about human nature in the context of war and human rights abuses and the kinds of issues that I worked on. And I had lots of sort of thoughts about human nature. I hadn't really thought much about the relationship between humans and nature itself, other than to the extent that environmental issues came up in the context of my work. So I was, committed to doing the book, and which I'd never written a book before. I didn't really know how to go about it, and I understood that I was going to be within this sort of category. There was one day when I wandered into a bookshop and I tried to find the relevant section, and I flinched because I saw this enormous piles and shelves of books that were in this category, and I thought to myself, if I start researching it, I'm going to get thoroughly intimidated. So I'm going to step back and I'm just going to try and do the best job I can to tell this story and not worry too much about being within a tradition. Yeah.
And I'm sure that will resonate with lots of people listening, is that, as a writer, and particularly as a first-time writer, it's perhaps not useful to try to preempt how your book will be received, and you just have to write your story or your experience. And then I suppose, yes, nature writing is part of a sort of whole publishing and book selling framework. It's a useful marketing tool as well, and it's a way to kind of situate. But actually, I suppose your book it's as much as it's nature writing, it's memoir, it might even be environmental science. As you say, it's a kind of very big, baggy category, nature writing. But yeah, I'm sure that would be reassuring to a lot of emerging writers, that you don't have to know.
Yes, no, I think you're absolutely right. If I can come back on that. I do think it is true that you have to. It's useful to understand, your book that you're working on has to be sold and to succeed, and therefore it's useful to have that kind of target that that you're aiming for to guide your thoughts. But really, I realized with hindsight that I had always been very drawn to literature that has a strong sense of place, that invokes landscape. I've always been very attuned myself, like lots of people, I imagine, strong emotional responses to beauty and landscape, and probably also to animals, I think with hindsight. And as a child, I'd certainly read a lot of books that concern relationships between humans and animals, sort of indirectly, because those are lots of the stories we're drawn to as children. So that I think the intellectual kind of underpinnings of, or a sense of what one might need to draw on to be required to write something in this space was sort of there in my mental landscape. But I tried not to be daunted by it. And I certainly tried not to go and find the 3 or 4 most successful books in that genre and say, why had they been successful and how can I sort of in some kind of way triangulate from that? I absolutely didn't do that. And maybe that works for some people, but I felt like the best thing I could do was to sort of withdraw into myself, think about this story, feel that deep sense of love for and excitement and joy about the story I wanted to tell, and then to trust that if I went astray, I'd have a good editor who would pull me back and say, right, no, we need to work on this a little bit.
And actually, just to follow on from that, I suppose you talk there about kind of your journey and what you're drawn to. And I think although nature writing is a very broad term, what we've seen in recent years is this huge kind of boom in popularity of books that, like yours, they are about nature and about wilderness or wildness, but they're really driven by personal experience and by a kind of an ability to write about a shift in perspective, a kind of what you've learned from nature. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on why those kinds of narratives are so attractive to readers right now, especially.
I still feel sort of ill-equipped to answer that kind of question about the market more broadly or response to books more broadly. But
I guess it's also why you were drawn to those books before you were writing them.
Oh, well, I it's such a key part of story, the landscape and environment and context in which something takes place and the pressures that puts on people, the heart of story. So I loved writing that was set at sea or in mountains, or tales of endurance and survival and adventure in which the interaction between the human and the environment, and actually animal. I mean, I loved Jack London when I was a younger reader, both for his depictions of humans and of nature. So I think, but in terms of what I was trying to do with this book, for me, it was really the character and identity of an animal, of this particular animal in its singularity, but also as a representative of a species that we don't normally interact with very much. Most people, if they see a hare, they'll see something running in the distance. They're notoriously secretive because they face so many threats. So I was thrust into this position unexpectedly of being able to observe one of these animals extremely closely, behaving naturally because it wasn't in a cage. It was coming and going as it wished. And there are all sorts of things I describe in the book that it does, that would mirror its life in the wild, that I was astonished to be able to witness up close. And I was able to write the book, when I wanted to satisfy myself about the coloration of a hare's whisker, I could go up close to this hare and look at her whiskers and write about it. But it was really, so I think in a way, obviously, to understand the animal, I had to understand its place in nature and its relationship to humans and the kinds of lives that hares live as a result of human activity. But I was very much thinking about the animal and the human, and a relationship between an animal and a human that's slightly different to the usual models of those kinds of bonds. So it's not a dog, it's not a cat, it's not a horse. It's an animal, as I say, that in thousands and thousands of years living alongside humans has never been domesticated, unlike those other species. So that's what was my focus. And I suppose maybe that is part of the appeal of those kinds of stories. We do love that idea of how you communicate across the language barrier with animals and what you can deduce of their feelings and emotions, if one can call them that as such. Getting onto thin ice here, but that's a sense of preserving relationship and experiencing relationship being part of the appeal of this particular book, perhaps, and of that tradition in general.
Absolutely. There's something about, can we ever understand something other to us? But actually, there's something really interesting I wanted to pick up on there, is that you talk about the hare as character, and you are the narrator of this story. This is also your story, but the main character really is the hare. And I think you mentioned at the beginning there that you very deliberately, you never gave the hare a name. You weren't trying to domesticate the hare. And I guess there's immediately then a challenge in your writing. And you do recognize this, and you talk about this in the book, how you avoid projecting human emotions onto an animal, anthropomorphizing, as we'd to use the big word.
Yes.
So could you perhaps talk a little bit about that as a challenge, and why you were trying to be so careful not to make it into a pet?
I had a sort of inner resistance to the idea of it being treated as a pet, and that was everybody's instinct. I had lots of suggestions for things I could call the hare, and people, understandably wanting to come and see it. And I had to resist some of those sort of completely natural requests, because I really didn't want the animal to feel threatened and for it to be handled, for instance. It was apparent that would cause it sort of distress. It remained a wild animal. And so having had that as a sort of inner instinct, it didn't come from any kind of sort of ideology, or I had not read anything about that. It was just a feeling that I had. It just felt weird to give this animal a name. And I know that it's a bit eccentric, and people might think it was the most natural thing in the world to name it. But my point being that having had that reaction and felt that to be important from the early days of living with the leveret, when I came to write the book, it was a challenge. And it was interesting as a writer how many times I would reach for a way of describing the behavior that I saw, and the temptation would be to describe it in human terms. And I remember one example very vividly, that the hares have this incredibly deep fur, and when it rains, the outer layer of the fur, it becomes completely drenched, and that's part of their sort of insulation system. So the hare, when she would come inside, would spend a long time drying herself each time. And there's a particular thing that she does where she bends her head to one side, puts her forepaws together around the root of her very, very long ears, and then squeezes the water out down the full length of the ear down to the very tip, which takes quite a long time, and doing this on each side. And it immediately evokes an image of a woman sort of wringing out her hair. And when I came to try to describe for people how she does this, that was, I almost reached for that metaphor in my mind. And I thought, no, hang on a second. That's not what I want to do. I don't want to say it's like something that we do. There was a conscious sort of discipline running through the process of writing the book, where I would find I write first by hand and then onto the laptop. So I would find my hand, sort of, I'd pause and sort of think, hang on, what am I projecting onto this creature? And how can I describe its behavior in the simplest and truest way possible, without the burden of all of those emotions that we have as humans, piling it on top of this wild creature and distorting its nature in some kind of way. So that was one of the layers of the things that I had in my mind when I was writing.
Yeah, and I think it's really, well, first off, it's very noticeable that you do that, because it helps you, as you've been saying, to kind of explore the relationship with the wild, and to kind of keep reminding the reader all along, it just by the way that you refer to the hare, that it is something that remains. There is a distance that remains between you, even though you have this close relationship. You will never be, owner and pet, as you say, like with a dog.
And there was something about that appealed to me. I think I describe it in the book that, I had the opportunity to study her, to learn all sorts of things about her, to be able to describe in minute details her behavior and her habits. But at the same time, there was this whole dimension of her existence that I still don't understand. I don't know. I glimpse her interacting with other hares when she's in the immediate proximity of the house. I was staring out the window and saw one of her earliest encounters with a wild hare, which was just absolutely astonishing to notice. But what she does at night, where she goes, how she, someone said to me, why don't you put a chip in her? This would be an amazing opportunity to be able to study the range of the hare. And I recoiled against it, because I just thought, well, I don't need to know. But I only mention it because of that combination of incredible proximity as a result of her feeling trust and safety in the house, but at the same time, this huge dimension of mystery that remains. And that's, I think, as it should be. And that is what the appeal of the wild is, the little that remains to us. And it was thrilling to me to realize that even within our very heavily domesticated landscape, there are these pockets of of wildness, of things, creatures that we don't understand as much as we think we do, and that can shed new light on what it is, to be human in a way and to interact with the wild.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, so you are the narrator, and obviously we get the sense of what the experience has meant to you, and the impact, the very deep impact that it's clearly had on your life. And I think you carry the reader through those changes with you, and that's part of the appeal and part of why I think we care so much. But I wonder if you could say, if it's possible to say, what the sort of biggest impact that this experience had on you, either practically or emotionally or both.
There is an extraordinary, for me, in the context of my own life, the fact that this utterly silent creature has enabled me to find my own voice, which can sound quite trite, but in the context of my life is quite profound for me, because I always wrote behind the scenes. I was the special advisor and speechwriter, and obviously it was known that's what I was doing, writing for very prominent, influential, famous people. And, as a result of doing that, I was able to, my words, reached, around the world in some instances. And that was incredibly fulfilling and rewarding for me as a writer, to find the words to meet those moments, to respond to crises, to ensure that I had this sort of power which I could use to ensure that certain values and ideas were contained in those words, and they were delivered in a certain tone, that mattered to me. But I had never published anything in my own name at all. And so through this experience, I've become an author. There's a book out there with my name on it. And that has been very, very profound shift for me, and opens up lots of doors for me. It means I can consider, writing another book, for instance. So that's one massive impact. But really, as a writer, you touched on it earlier, this idea of seeing, noticing, observing, learning, applying myself to a totally new realm, both as a writer, but also as a human, and how enriching that's been, how much I've learned, and the kind of emotions that I've been able to access. Working in politics, obviously I would tap into emotion in order for the writing to be compelling, but there was also a sort of effacing of self, and I got very good at separating how I felt about something with what was required, circumstances of what I was responding to, and the person that I was writing for. So to be able to sort of connect that as a whole, and to go through an experience myself, to feel it fully, to allow myself to change, to be open to that experience, and then to find a way to express it as a writer in my own name. And in the process, I hope to shed some light on hares and how beautiful they are and how misunderstood they are and what they represent in our landscape. So that to do all of that, or to endeavour to do all of that, I couldn't really ask for more. It's probably as good as it gets.
It sounds very profound. And I think that is really interesting what you say about voice, and also I suppose about the style that you previously wrote in and now are writing into, because, as you say, speeches and that kind of writing, yes, it's about very careful observation, but perhaps in a different way. And actually, one thing I wanted to ask you about that writing style is about pace, because something that's very interesting through the book, and I think and you articulate it so beautifully in the book, is that through kind of your observation and your noticing of the hare's behavior, it's almost like the hare influences your pace of life just through its sort of habits and its routines. And I think there's a beautiful observation about the fact that, wild animals are actually very, they cling to habit, and actually they can be quite predictable in their routines. And I just wondered whether, well, that sort of you learned from the hare in a practical sense about pacing your own life, but also whether that then affected your writing, because it is a very beautifully paced, sort of even narrative.
Well, thank you. It's a really good question. I think it must have done, because as writers, the personal, how you're feeling in that moment influences so much of what comes out on the page. And I did, being anchored for the first time in my life to a particular place, to in many respects, unremarkable patch of the English landscape, and as a result of my gaze following the hare, not only observing the hare in the home, but following her as far as I could with my gaze when she would be across the fields, and thinking therefore about the landscape that she inhabited, and seeing that patch of land change every day with the seasons and the weather, and then trying to write about that. In some respects, a story in which not a great deal happens. And certainly, when in my writing before, it was not about novelty, but, I was hurtling around the world. One day you'd be writing about the Middle East, the next day about part of Africa, third day about trade or something, and there wouldn't be much continuity. You wouldn't necessarily go back to the places that you've been to where these urgent crises were taking place. So I think the rhythm of her life and the rhythm of that patch of landscape and the need to try to tell a story centered on this animal, which, as you say, more or less does the same thing every day with some particular variations and some surprises along the way, definitely affected how I wrote the book. And I mean, you haven't directly asked this, but I think the one thing that had really helped me from my prior writing life was a habit of editing, sort of a love for editing in a way, editing myself, being, trying to be as sort of concise and precise as possible, thinking about nuances of words, because particularly in the world of foreign policy, substituting one word for another can sort of cause huge problems and make an enormous difference. So I think I had a habit of really thinking about the text, and that therefore I enjoyed the part of the writing process that involved sculpting, and I really enjoyed the research, which I think I was also in a good position because I wasn't researching while I was writing per se, because I'd done all the thinking about the hare when I didn't know I was writing a book. So it had all sort of percolated through me in some kind of way, and I didn't have to have the pace of the story disrupted by the need to turn to an encyclopedia or try to sort of research a whole chapter before writing it. And perhaps that in some kind of way helped me with the pace.
That's so interesting what you say about the research. I'd love to talk a little bit more about that, because it seems that there's a huge amount of research which has gone into this book. I mean, I presume that's something, I think you even mentioned that that's something you were sort of used to doing with your career anyway. But I mean, there is so much, because there's the cultural history of hares here. There's things about law and about land. And I just wonder how you sort of tackled refining that research and being selective about it.
But it's kind of you to say that, because all I can see in other writers who relate to this is everything I wasn't able to go deeply into with the constraints of the story. I would have loved to have traveled around the world, thinking about how hares are represented in other cultures and other religions. But I couldn't do that. So I think when I look at it, I think of all the things that I know that I could have gone into more deeply, but that I couldn't because of time and the constraints of the story. But I think it's, again, maybe I'm just so lucky. This has been such a sort of gift from nature, this whole experience, to land in my lap in this way. And because of the circumstances of the pandemic and all those long evenings when we couldn't go out and do things, I happened to order up books on hares and read everything I could, just for the sheer pleasure of trying to understand the subject and as I said, the practical needs of looking after this creature. So, for instance, like finding examples of what I could feed a hare from the poems of William Cooper, who not only did he write epitaph on a hare, but wrote all sorts of other things about living with hares that were very useful to me. So I did, obviously, I don't want to be misleading. When I was writing the book, I would check facts, and I was still discovering new sources throughout the process. But I do think it had helped that I had immersed myself in the subject long before I had thought about writing a book. So I think perhaps when I came to writing it, I wasn't sort of self-consciously sort of setting out to try to chart the things I'd have to learn in order to do justice to the subject, if that makes sense.
It does. So, it sounds like the research gave you a confidence.
Yes, and also because it was so new to me, because I'm not, I think it helped that for this particular book anyway, that I'm not a scientist or a naturalist or a conservationist. And so I was learning really from the ground up, from the basics up. And it produced in me such a feeling of happiness to have a reason to try to understand grass and plants and woods and rainbows and, things I was observing and weather systems. And so, and of course, I never got very deep into any of those subjects, but I would read a book about it, and while looking at the hare and trying to understand the hare. And I found myself sort of laughing at my lack of knowledge, and hope some of that comes out on the page, in the sense I've not set out to write a definitive study of hares, but to sort of say, if there's so much more to this supposedly commonplace little creature than you might even imagine. How that must be so true of so many other things in our landscape and in the natural world as a whole. So I think I tried to bring a lightness to it because I knew I couldn't write as any of those subject experts could on this subject, and I couldn't study the hare the way that a biologist or I don't even know the terminology, but somebody who makes it their life's business to study a scientist, perhaps. I tried therefore to ensure I wanted the story to have a simplicity to it and to be centered on the animal and to be centered on observation of the animal. And I drew in things that were interesting to me in a way that I hope is sort of keeps the book accessible rather than has great big digressions about.
No, it certainly does. And I think that, you talk there about the joy and the sort of excitement you felt. It really does come across. And I was just thinking back to an earlier part of our conversation about kind of why these sorts of narratives appeal to readers. And I think it's partly that because they remind us how much we don't know, but how much we could know, and just that you don't have to know much in order to feel that joy or that excitement or connection. And I think that's something, that
that's actually a really good point, because I think because I had worked in the world of politics, so I was surrounded by a lot of people who'd written biographies or historical books, and they talked, they were talking passing about their research, and it always, therefore in my mind, the idea of writing a book was always something which sounded very kind of like weighty. And maybe that's partly why I didn't ever see myself doing it, because I thought, well, that's, you have to spend years and you have to sort of, cover the entire literature, and I'm not that kind of person. I know I need to go from subject to subject like a bee across the flower bed. And so it was nice to me to realize that it was possible with this simple story and the knowledge and ideas and feelings that had coalesced around it, that I could make a book and write a book. I suppose, and maybe it sounds terribly sort of naive somehow, but I suppose I've taken from it a sense that you can make a lot out of a little, actually, as a writer, if the subject really seizes you.
Absolutely. Amen to that. So actually, one last thing I want to make sure that we talk about, very much in relation to your book, but I think to nature writing more generally, is that I think as the book goes on, you delve into, and I think readers are made more and more aware of, the dangers and the risks to the hare, which come from human intervention in the landscape, really. And you talk about modern farming methods, about land management, commercial interests. And so I guess I sort of have two questions. The first being, did you ever hesitate to include the less palatable side of the natural world, and or did you feel a responsibility to raise awareness by including it?
Well, there is some death and sadness and destruction in the book at a couple of points, and that is really true to the natural world, as you imply. And one of the things I learned, because I had obviously this instinct to try to protect the hare, and the landscape, once you become conscious of it, is just teeming with predators of one type or another, stoats and foxes and buzzards and things. And I tried sometimes to put myself between the hare and these dangers, while realizing, of course, that's absolutely absurd. I can't do that. And I saw quite frequently, and even beyond, since writing the book, I've seen many more instances of nature red in tooth and claw. But I got a deeper understanding of how that balance. Hares are actually safer in an environment where there are more predators and better balance, because partly things like they don't like rabbits particularly, and so you need a good balance in the whole sort of ecosystem to keep down the population to natural levels so that other creatures like hares can thrive. Anyway, on the question of human activity, I did hesitate because I thought, I'm not, it's going to sound like I've just come from the city and I've spent a year in the countryside and therefore I'm suddenly an expert and I've actually got farmers in the family, and I know from how difficult their lives are and how much they contribute to the fact the landscape looks the way that it does and how much they care. So I wanted to handle it I wanted to describe what I saw. There's a scene in the book about the potato harvest and the unintended knock-on effect on wildlife in that particular field, which I describe. I don't pull my punches, and I described everything I saw, really. But I just wanted to try to tell it as part of the story, truthfully and simply, to bring in a little bit of knowledge for people to understand the context and how this is a problem across the country, but not to sort of wag my finger at any point. And
no.
I think there's such we're always asked, and even, now doing publicity around the book, we have this habit of going, okay, so now tell us what should be done. And sometimes I think there's just merit in just telling a story and seeing how it lands with others. And these conversations are complex about how we achieve food security while protecting nature or restoring some of the biodiversity that we've lost. And I care a lot about it, like everyone listening, I'm sure, but I don't pretend to be an expert. And so I tried to hold off in the book at points at which I could veer off into sort of saying what I thought needed to be done about these issues. And it felt that it would kind of break the voice of the story in a way. And also it felt that I wouldn't be qualified to do it, and I therefore might end up, I don't want the book to be divisive. I would love people to say, to realize, to enjoy the mystery and beauty of hares and to think about how we might better protect them, but for that to be a conversation rather than something that someone like me goes around stipulating.
Certainly. And I think it is very carefully described in the book. And it doesn't feel like you're coming down on one side or another. I just think it's really interesting. And I wonder whether actually, with contemporary nature writing, whether it's possible for that as a genre to feel relatable or meaningful if it doesn't engage with sort of the realities and the difficult issues that are facing us, like climate change or human interventions.
Yeah, well, it is sad. They live such short lives, these creatures anyway. And, I've seen so many instances of them being cut short. Leveret survival rates are very, very low. And when you go out and see a leveret that's been crushed or drowned, because of floods, which I've seen quite a lot of actually, or frozen to death because the weather systems are changing slightly and the cold snaps come at strange intervals. It hurts. It's upsetting, and that has to be part of the story because it's part of nature and it's part of human existence as well.
Absolutely. I think we've got time for one more question. So I want to ask you, you describe towards the end of the book all the things that you're grateful to the hare for. And I was thinking about nature writing in general. And I think that it feels like writers have to be prepared to share or to show this kind of humility in nature writing for it to truly connect with readers. So I wonder if you could tell us the thing that you're most grateful to the hare for.
Sorry, I'm pausing because I'm just thinking about your question about the need to be humble. I didn't really, I knew that there was just so many extraordinary things had to come together for me to have that experience. And when those things happen in life and when they lead to change in us and bring all sorts of benefits, it's hard not to feel anything other than small and humble, because it so easily could not have happened and my life would be very different as a result. But I think it's a sense of reverence. I think, the astonishing thing about nature is that whatever stage you come to it in your life, it's there waiting for you. It's somehow extremely forgiving. Whatever we do to it, it does its best to recover. My enjoyment of it doesn't diminish yours. It's our one, I think I say in the book, true sort of shared heritage. And when you do discover it, I came to it really rather late, but there's this, there's awe, there's wonder, there are all these emotions that sometimes the words that we bandy around are almost sort of detached from real meaning somehow, but really nature does provoke those kinds of feelings. And it was impossible not to write the book without it being infused with that kind of feeling. I have spent, nearly 4 years now studying this animal and marveling at its behavior, and I still haven't gotten to the bottom of it. There's still things I don't understand, and that's a metaphor from so many other things in life, but it has produced unlimited amounts of interest and joy, and I'm just grateful for that, because those feelings can at various intervals in our life be in short supply.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Chloe, for this conversation today. I feel like it's been rich with not just information about hares, but about your writing process and about how other people might find your way in. So thank you so much. And we heartily recommend Raising Hare to everybody listening.
Thank you. I really enjoyed talking to you.
A huge thank you to Chloe Dalton and Holly for sharing their time with us today. Make sure to pick up a copy of Chloe's book, Raising Hare, from your favourite bookshop or local library. If you have any questions or just want to get in touch, you can find us on Instagram and Blue Sky at Writers Centre, connect with us on Facebook, or sign up for the NCW newsletter at nationalcentreforwriting.org.uk. As a UK registered charity, we rely on the generous support of our community to continue our work. If you'd like to help, you can make a donation on our website by visiting the Support Us page. And if you've enjoyed today's episode, please do consider subscribing to the podcast and leaving us a 5-star rating and a review. This helps others to find us. Thanks again for listening, keep writing, and I'll catch you on the next episode.